An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, Benjamin Franklin. In recent years, one of the health and safety executive's strategic regulatory focus areas is a reduction in worker ill health associated with workplace exposure to substances hazardous to health. This has led to targeted inspections and an increase in regulatory interventions, whether it is a word of warning or more formal sanctions. Health is becoming as prominent as safety, and it is important that organizations are equipped to respond to the regulatory requirements placed on them through the control of substances hazardous to health regulations, also known as COSHH, as applicable to their business. My name is Alex Miniotis, and I'm joined by Paul Verrico and Charlotte Wood of Evershed Sutherland to discuss the legal duties placed on organizations where employees are or are likely to be exposed to substances hazardous to their health, key themes of failure and the sanctions that could be imposed. Paul, Charlotte, can you please tell us a bit about why you are the people to discuss this? And I'll throw it over to you, Paul, first.
That sounds like it. It's an honour to be back on the podcast, Alex. And as you know, Evershed Sutherland is a world-leading health and safety practice. We advise organisations across Europe, the US, Australia, and of course the UK, across all sorts of compliance topics. And COSHH is one of those compliance topics because it's a place where people often get it wrong. And the kind of ways that we help people is rationalising the law and the guidance, because sometimes it can be quite hard to work out what is actually required. We help them write their risk assessments. And then I suppose what we're famous for is defending our clients when they are subject to enforcement action by a domestic regulator. In the UK, that being the Health and Safety Executive or the Office of Rail and Road, more widely OSHA or whatever local enforcement authority in Europe. And then on the other side of it, we also operate a safety consultancy, and we have undertaken various occupational health compliance reviews, benchmarking what clients are doing in their own health and safety management system against what the law requires. Because a lot of people want to be ahead of the curve and they don't want to be in trouble with the regulator. They want to do the right thing. And so we're helping them with proactive measures. So that's kind of our background and why we feel that we're probably the right people to speak to you on this podcast.
So, hi, I'm Charlotte Wood. Alongside Paul, I've been involved in cases where the Health and Safety Executive and other regulators, including the ARR, have undertaken investigations which is centred around failure to manage COSHH, and that includes exposure to fumes, wood dust, and other hazardous chemicals. The common non-conformance that we see as alleged by the regulator is a failure to have a suitable and sufficient risk assessment and over-reliance on respiratory protective equipment. So we'll go on to explore this in a bit more in the podcast in terms of how to mitigate against that risk.
So thank you for that. Can you give us a bit of background on hazardous substances and the legal framework?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I'm not going to give you a full history lesson, but clearly humans have over the decades and centuries developed technologies where at times we thought that things were safe and then we found out that they're not. And that goes all the way back to when people lauded asbestos. I've seen adverts actually where they were actually putting asbestos blankets around babies to help them soothe them and sleep better 80 or 90 years ago. So the evolution of COSHH comes from understanding that things can be bad for you and that might not be an immediate effect. And safety across Europe has centred on actual physical safety. So the way in which someone can be harmed directly by an action at work. And that's been really successful in reducing the number of fatalities that have occurred at work, bringing them down literally by hundreds or thousands across each European country. What has happened is that that's now plateaued, and domestic regulators are looking at health, which still takes a terrible toll of human life, and have started to come up with ways to try and minimise the way in which people are exposed to things that can be carcinogens or can give them occupational asthma and have a deleterious effect on their health. So that's where the horizon has moved to. And in the UK, that's been codified in legislation. The general legislation is in the Primary Health and Safety at Work Act, which is now 50 years old. And that says quite simply that employers must ensure the health, and I'll pause there because there's a comma, and then safety and welfare so far as is reasonably practicable. And that health aspect is the bit that COSHH focuses on. And it's an important component of the legal test that employers have got to meet. They grapple with it because when you are looking at reasonable practicability, does that mean that you eliminate exposure in its entirety? Or does that mean that you put in place reasonably practicable controls to limit the exposure? Because in the hierarchy of risk that's common around the world, elimination is top of the pyramid. Then you get into questions about respiratory, protective, personal equipment. Does that go far enough? Should you have local exhaust ventilation? And in what circumstances do you need to do that? There's no one size fits all. There's lots of factors that go into the equation, such as work environment, type and duration of exposure, external conditions, etc. And so because it's kind of quite wide, Europe, decades ago, began to bring about specific requirements where there is exposure to substances hazardous to health. And those are substances that can cause ill health through inhalation or skin contact. And the European Union produced an appendix to the COSHH regulations setting out a number of substances and chemicals that an organisation needs to provide a COSHH risk assessment for. And with any kind of COSHH risk assessment, once you've done it, you've then obviously got to implement the controls. And the idea is that exposure is prevented or adequately controlled. I know that's quite a long-winded answer to the question, but it does trace its roots back to technology, an evolving landscape, and then what is going to happen to try and make people be able to continue their working life without it seriously impacting them.
So with that, and I might throw this to you, Charlotte, what is reasonably practicable in the context of COSHH management?
It's a good question, Lex. I think Paul had mentioned earlier on that a lot of clients grapple with the concept of reasonable practicability. And it is a difficult question to answer, and it's very much specific in terms of what the work activity is or what substances is used. I suppose not unlike the general position with health and safety compliance, there is a hierarchy of control. In the regulations, it does refer to this as the specific protection measures that have to be considered when understanding what are reasonable practicable controls that look at eliminating or reducing exposure. Employees must look at the design and use of appropriate work processes, systems and engineering controls, and use of suitable work equipment and materials. So that could mean swapping hazardous substances for a safer material, controlling exposure at source, and that could include installation of local exhaust ventilation. It could be use of personal protective equipment, such as respiratory protective equipment as well. What the regulators will not endorse is over-reliance on respiratory protective equipment. And that can come in all sorts of forms. You can have the air-fed respirators, or you can have the dust mask that we wore during the COVID pandemic. Regardless of the type of respiratory protective equipment that you will use, over-reliance on that as the primary control, as I said, is something that the regulator will not endorse. So the law is quite clear that there is a hierarchy of control that you have to follow methodically, and that the regulator will want to see justification as to why a decision has been made to use a particular control. And if there is a criticism, then that needs to be addressed accordingly.
Okay, so Paul, I might ask you, what common issues do you see clients facing?
I think there are two things. One is the proactive piece when an employee or a contractor feels that they are exposed to things that they shouldn't be, whether that be because there's been an elevated level of something found in water. So we've recently done a case where lead has been found in a water supply, and that got people really concerned, even though actually the results were negligible and there was no possible harm. But sometimes you have the worried well who just find an anomaly in whatever the situation might be, and that causes there need to be an investigation, either to find out if there is a problem or to make sure that people are informed of what the actual real risk is. But sometimes substances, just by their very name, scare us. And then the other thing is when there's a regulatory involvement, because there's maybe been a report due to the fact that there has been some kind of industrial condition found in someone. So a typical example might be occupational asthma caused by wood dust. And all of that tends to be, its root cause is a failure to produce a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. And we could say that for nearly anything when people get themselves into bother. If they'd assessed the risks properly, they'd have put the control measures in place and people wouldn't come to harm. COSHH is a bit different because we actually get better data on risk profile than we do in other areas. So clients get what's called a safety data sheet, and those are common across the European Union, and that's provided by the manufacturer of the substances, and that creates an analysis of the risk that's there. In the UK, we call it Regulation 6, and there's a parallel regulation across Europe, and it provides a very, very long list of criteria that an employer must follow when providing the risk assessment. So, for instance, what are the hazardous properties of the substance? What are the health effects? What's the level? What's the duration? What's the type of exposure? And for anyone at any level in the UK to qualify as a safety practitioner, they've got to be able to produce an example of a COSHH risk assessment as part of their portfolio for submission, because it's just such a crucial piece of legislation and a crucial way to stop people being hurt.
And Charlotte?
Yeah, so it's there are lots of kind of common pitfalls that we see in regards to COSHH management, because as Paul has mentioned, it's very specific in terms of what is required of an employer. Another issue that I see is lack of assurance activities. So you've got a risk assessment, which is often a lengthy document, can be quite complex, has to be drafted by a competent person, usually an occupational or preferably an occupational health professional or a hygiene professional, because they are quite complex to draft sometimes, depending on the type of substance that you're working with and the activities that are underway. They are not always translated very well to the workforce. There's a real lack of understanding of what's actually expected of them during their work activity. And that then lends itself to insufficient information, instruction and training, which is a separate breach under a separate regulation, which we won't go into today. But there's often a lack of assurance activities. So the employer going out onto the shop floor, for example, and having a look at whether the employees are actually following what they should be. So if they're meant to wear our respiratory protective equipment that's not air fed, are they clean shaven? Are they following good hygiene protocols? Are they making sure that they are using local exhaust ventilation where that's necessary? And with local exhaust ventilation, you then have to make sure that it's sufficiently maintained, that filters are replaced, etc. So it's that assurance activity that doesn't always take place to monitor that the arrangements are actually working.
So, Paul, my next question is, how important is health surveillance?
Health surveillance is incredibly important. It is the essential feature of the regulations after risk assessment. It informs the COSHH risk assessment because it will say how many people could be at risk, and what are the existing controls, and also crucially, are they working properly? And that allows trend analysis and allows the organisation to better organise itself in the long run. And of course, part of the problem is that things like the workplace exposure limits change. So what might have been state of the art 20 years ago, and again, wood dust is a really good example, what was a permitted level even 5 years ago and would mean you were legally compliant, you wouldn't be legally compliant if people are exposed to that now. And part of that's because the health surveillance has demonstrated that actually what we thought was a tolerable level of risk actually isn't, because that level of exposure can create people to get a health condition. So it involves not just local industry, but it also involves the national approach to controlling these kind of situations.
Charlotte?
I think what is occupation health surveillance will, the extent and frequency will depend on kind of what substances they're exposed to and kind of what the business wants to do. I think what is often missed by the organisations is a baseline health assessment, which should take place during the onboarding of new employees, so that there is an understanding before the employee joins the organisation whether they have any pre-existing health conditions or any sensitisation, and where employees are likely to be exposed to substances hazardous to health, then they should really be provided with ongoing health surveillance, and that should include respiratory checks alongside others like audiometry or vibration for hand-arm vibration, etc. So it's really, really important health surveillance, and and obviously it has to be included as part of the COSHH risk assessment anyway, to inform, as Paul has mentioned, whether the controls are working or whether there needs to be a bit of a change in terms of the approach.
So I think with that in mind, obviously it's very, very important health surveillance, monitoring, making sure that people's health is on track. But if you're in a situation where you've actually find that someone has been diagnosed with ill health, do you need or have a duty to report it to the HSC? And I might throw that to you, Charlotte.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, the reporting of injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrences regulations require an employer to report a diagnosis of an occupational disease, and that will include occupational asthma along with hand-arm vibration and other specified occupational diseases as set out in the regulations. So reportable disease must be diagnosed by a doctor and includes a situation where a doctor has identified any new symptoms or any significant worsening of existing symptoms. That duty sits with the employer to report to the regulator, and that does often trigger an investigation by the regulator as well, in terms of they'll come in and have a look at whether the COSHH risk assessment is suitable and sufficient, or whether it's not, and are the controls working, and if they aren't, has this then resulted in somebody being diagnosed with occupational disease?
Paul, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think we come back to that whole thing about being able to make sure that people are supporting. We often look at regulators as a lawyer as some kind of sinister force for bad, but clearly, obviously, they're not. And it stems from the fact that sometimes our clients feel persecuted rather than prosecuted. What's really important is that employees need to be supported, and ultimately, organisations like a domestic regulator produce codes of practice to generally improve the health of everybody at work, and that's a good thing. So this idea of reporting diagnosed occupational health to a regulator allows them to set national policy and to make sure that workplace controls are better put in place. What I should add to that is that quite often the very worst environments are small organisations where maybe the controls through a lack of investment are limited. The larger organisations, typically, if they think there is a problem, will do everything they can to minimise that. And having that regulatory kind of potential consequence is one way that keeps the mind fresh and focuses one on the issues that are at hand.
So you've mentioned real examples of where the HSC, for example, has identified areas of non-compliance and trends that you're seeing. What is the regulator's enforcement approach here? And I might throw that to you, Charlotte.
So if we're looking at the Health and Safety Executive as an example, and I suspect comparative regulators in other jurisdictions will have similar powers available to them. They can serve, they can provide advice, and that is informal advice or they can provide more formal advice, or take more or formal enforcement action. So they can serve an improvement notice, which requires a employer to improve the existing arrangements, for example, COSHH management. And that can be quite specific. They can say, well, actually, you need to improve the quality of your risk assessment because you're not following the regulations, or actually, we don't believe that the controls that you have in place are suitable and sufficient, and you've got over-reliance on respiratory protective equipment. Or they can serve a prohibition notice, which can prohibit a work activity or the use of a particular work area. And that can have serious consequences for an organisation because it effectively shuts down. It could shut down a plant, or it can shut down a particular work activity. So that can have serious consequences. There is a possibility in the UK for the regulator to take more formal enforcement action by way of prosecution. And if prosecuted, the fines can be very large. It's based on an organisation's turnover. And they look at, the sentencing judge will look at the health and safety sentencing guideline. Depending on the size of an organisation and the extent and severity of the breach, fines can be 6 to 7 figure sums. So they are large fines that are levied against organisations for failure to comply with COSHH regulations.
And looking at the enforcement statistics in the UK, so the UK publishes its statistics in a database which is publicly accessible. 580 organisations received what's called improvement notice. These are the enforcement notices described where they've got to actually put right whatever the failure was. 8 organisations were prosecuted within the last 4 months, all of which were convicted. So there's a shift towards working with hazardous substances and making sure that people are putting controls in place and the environments are as safe as possible. And that's got to be right.
So finally, do we have any final remarks, Paul?
I suppose COSHH is an area which is actually easy to get right because the framework is so prescriptive. What is really important is to make sure that you've got people who are qualified doing the risk assessment, that they are aware of the regulatory requirement for how specific it has got to be, and that you don't just outsource your COSHH compliance to a third-party contractor who might be effectively cut and pasting things from all sorts of different sources. So a lot of times we say we're safe, well, there's no right or wrong answer. With COSHH there is, because there's a material data safety sheet which says what the risks are. You know who works for you, you know what your risks are, so you can get it right. And so there should be no surprises. And it is traditionally and still the number one cause of death in each of the European countries at work. People are no longer dying in great numbers, thankfully, from falling at height or the like. What they are doing is succumbing to industrial diseases from long-term latent health problems.
And Charlotte, any last final remarks?
So just following on from Paul's comments, I think it's just going back to basics. It's going back to the regulations, particularly the risk assessment regulation 6 in the UK, and just making sure that you are ticking all of those boxes. And I mentioned earlier kind of the importance of the assurance activities, and I think if that is not something that an organisation has in place, or it's not something that they routinely do, it is something that needs to be a priority, because it does help understand whether the controls are working and whether the workforce are following what they should be doing to ultimately reduce worker exposure.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul and Charlotte, for your time today. We very much appreciate it. I might end this podcast with a quote from Mokokoma Mokonoana, and I hope I got that name right, but I certainly know the quote. It is usually impossible to know when you have prevented an accident. So bear that in mind, because the law does require you to adequately control exposure to materials in the workplace that cause ill health. The breadth of potential is enormous. prevention, as they say, is better than the cure. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and thank you, Paul and Charlotte.
Thank you.